Okay, so now I can make it small again. Stop share. Okay, so we will wait until the proper time. We realize that on Sunday right before Hanukkah, it may be difficult for people to zoom in, but that's why they can watch the recording later.
Yeah. With the time lapse with Amsterdam, I will leave at 7 o'clock. That's 8 o'clock your time.
Right, in order to light candles.
To join my own Kirala.
Right, I see you have candles there on the table. Very nice.
Yeah, we are good.
Yeah, in the States, it's far from candle lighting time still.
Yeah. Here I have all my old family. Hanukkiyah is already burning.
Very nice.
This is that's from the Kela with the children, some festivities, and we join in with our candles.
Oh, very nice, very nice. Mm-hmm. And I see Rabbi Alicia Rosenwasser is here. Rabbi Alicia, where are you? In which city?
Bluebell, Pennsylvania.
Ah, you're in Bluebell. Okay, yeah.
David Ackerman's old.
Right. Yeah, fair.
Yep. How are you? Chag
Baruch
Sameach.
Hashem, good. Chag Sameach. We still have a few minutes. Yecheskel Dori. Yeah, fair. Vicky. Shalom, Vicky.
Shalom. The grandchildren left. They forgot they didn't realize school today.
Okay, well, I'm glad to see you. You're at Kibbutz Beit Hashita.
Right.
Yeah, fair.
Thank you.
Well, we realized today it would be tough for people to join, but on the other hand, we didn't want to do it next Sunday, which is the end of Hanukkah. So we're catching the very beginning.
It was a great first Hanukkah day planned in the concert hall, but it's all cancelled now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I always enjoy as more and more people join. It's like the Jewish world,
the
Jewish world coming together from all over the world. I see Rabbi Raphael Miller from Florida. Rabbi Joe Schoenwald in Jerusalem. Rabbi Joe Prauser in New Jersey. Wow, is he off?
Is it okay to be here if you're not a rabbi?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We usually have way more lay people than rabbis, but maybe the rabbis are
only the rabbis. So
maybe the rabbis. Okay. No, it's just I happen to know a lot of them. Maybe the rabbis want some chomer lidrush, some good material for their drashot during Hanukkah. So I see all the way Rabbi Joe Borodin, all the way from Seattle, Washington. B'siyata Dishmaya, Rabbi Herb Yaskowitz from Detroit. I was once at an RA convention in 1986, and Rabbi Yaakov Rosenberg, Zichrono Livracha, they were raising money for a certain thing. He was the vice chancellor of JTS in the 1980s. He went around the room. He knew the name of every single rabbi in the room, and there were hundreds of people there. I'm not that good, but I know a lot of rabbis. Okay, we'll start. We'll start when my iPhone says it's 7 o'clock Jerusalem time. We don't want to start early because Jews would get very upset.
They don't know they don't know the meaning of the word early.
Right now. Dov Isaacs, all the way from California, Yafet. Rabbi David Rosen from Houston. Okay, we'll even wait one more minute because I see that people are still joining. My brother, Cantor Abe Golinkin, Baruch Haba. Okay, it's 7:01, so we're going to begin. Please feel free to show your faces so I can see you. It's hard to talk to a blank screen.
I will just say that I'm going to put Rabbi Golinkin on a spotlight so you could all see him, and I'm going to mute you just for one second.
Michal, I would prefer to see everybody.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so Bruchim Habayim. One of the only good effects of the pandemic during the past year and 8 months has been the fact that we can now study Torah together with people throughout the world. And we began by Zooming into Shavuot a year and a half ago. And we've now held Zoom into the respective holiday for every single major holiday since then. This is our second round of Zoom into Hanukkah, and we've already had a second round of many of the holidays. And we have a very nice lineup tonight of different professors, most of whom teach at the Schechter Institutes. I will be teaching Hanukkah Exotica, Hanukkah Customs from East to West, Part 2. We started last year. Dr. Shula Laderman will be teaching from the Menorah to the Hanukkiyah in Jewish art. Dr. Doron Lopez will be teaching the true stories of Hanukkah, a comparison of first and second Maccabees, the historical aspect. And Dr. Tanya Sermer will be teaching Handel, Heroism, and the New Jew pre-state songs for Hanukkah. There are some of the classic Hanukkah songs from before 1948. So we have customs, history, art, and music. Without further ado, I will delve into my topic. I figured out that if I keep doing 2 customs per year, I have enough material for about 10 more years, God willing. There are many, many Hanukkah customs. And last year, we dealt with the subject of Megillat Hanukkah, the scroll of Hanukkah, which I'm not going to repeat now. And we talked about the history of the Sevivon or the dreidel. This year, we're going to talk about 2 Hanukkah customs, one of which most Jews in the world know nothing about, which is a very interesting custom. And the other one, I believe, is still observed by many Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews in the world. And it was a custom that has existed among Ashkenazic Jews for many hundreds of years, and that is the custom of playing cards on Hanukkah. The first custom, I purposely did not say what it is, because the custom is called katovus, or katofus, or katabos. We don't even know how to pronounce it, but we know what it is. The custom of katofus on Hanukkah was a custom that's first mentioned in the 15th century, which is at the Seudat Hanukkah, at the big meals we have on Hanukkah, and of course Jews like to eat on Hanukkah, we play riddles and word games. And those riddles and word games were called, among Ashkenazic Jews beginning in the 15th century, katovus. I'll talk about the etymology of the word at the end, because that in and of itself is a lecture. There are 11 different etymologies that have been suggested for what the word comes from. But I'm not so much interested in the etymology as in the custom. So I'm going to put it up on the screen. And when we send around the recordings, we will send around my parts of my English article. I published an article called Hanukkah Exotica, which you can find on the Schechter Institute website, Hanukkah Exotica. It appeared also in my book, Inside Israel, Volume 2, and it originally appeared in Conservative Judaism magazine 20 years ago. So when we send this around, we'll include the English. In order to understand these riddles, we have to look at the Hebrew because these are riddles in Hebrew. So let's see if I can pull it up. Can you all see the screen? Okay. It says at the top, Katofas or Katovas for Hanukkah. And this was my latest version, edited some 8 years ago. And the first mention of this custom of Katofas is by a Jew whose name was Rabbi Yozel Hochstadt. And his name is important, as you'll see in a moment, because his name is included in some of these riddles. Rabbi Yozel, which is, of course, the diminutive form of Joseph. Rabbi Yozel was a devoted disciple of Rabbi Israel Isserlein. Rabbi Israel Isserlein died in 1460 in Austria, and Rabbi Yozel wrote his book about 10 years later in the year 1470. And Rabbi Yozel reports that his Rebbe, Rabbi Yisrael, every Hanukkah asa katofas, he made katofas with some of the bachurim, with some of the yeshiva students, and the katofas had to do with Hanukkah and sometimes with other topics. And then he gives 9 examples of the riddles they used to share with each other at the Hanukkah table while eating special Hanukkah foods. So I'm going to give you, we're not going to do all 9 examples. I think we'll only do a part of them. We'll start with an easy one, which is number 2. He says, my name is Yozel, Shmi Yozel. Hafshet beged mimeni, take off my cloak. Az timtza minyani, then you will find my number. So I'll give you a hint. He's using gematria here. Gematria is the numerical value of Hebrew letters. He says, my name is Yozel. Does anybody know how much Yozel is in gematria? If you're good at, not at math, but at arithmetic. Yozel in gematria is 53. He says, my name is Yozel, which is worth 53. Take away a beged from me. What is beged in gematria? Bet, gimel, and dalet. It's 9. So I am 53. Take away 9 from me. Az timtza minyani, then you will find my number. What is 53 minus 9? 53 minus 9 is 44. Now, what's special about the number 44 on Hanukkah? And anybody who knows the answer, I will throw them a sufganiya through the internet.
The number of candles.
Right, yafeh. 44 is the total number of candles on Hanukkah. There are 36 candles that we light, plus 8 shamashim, 44. So the riddle is, take my name, Yozel, 53, take off my cloak, my beged from me, and you will arrive at my number, which is 44. So we see that many of these riddles have to do with the candles on Hanukkah. Okay, here's another example. Number 4. Eved nofel leha'aloto nizkakim lamo. If the servant falls, we must stand him up. V'ilu ha'adon ki yipol, but if the master falls, ein ish bala kimo, nobody has to stand him up. So if the servant falls, you have to stand him up. If the master falls, you do not have to stand him up again. What is the subject of this riddle? Can anyone guess?
Yeah.
The shamas?
The candles, yafeh.
The shamas.
The candles and the shamash, exactly.
Yeah.
According to Jewish law, and this is found in the Talmud and in the Shulchan Aruch, if the shamash gets blown out, you have to light it again because you want to make sure not to be using the light from the Hanukkah candles. You want to use the light from the shamash. But if one of the Hanukkah candles blows out, you do not have to relight that candle. So the irony is that if the servant falls, you have to set him up. You have to relight the shamash. But if the candle, one of the candles falls, einish balakimo, you don't have to relight that candle. So in a very clever fashion, this riddle is getting across one of the laws of the Hanukkah candles. And number 5 is very similar, though the words are different. Nizkakim la'eved shehu machor l'sharet. We need the servant, which was sold to serve. Uvemitata adon yotze lecherut. But when the master dies, the servant goes free. In other words, once the candles die, then you no longer need the shamas. You no longer need that extra candle to light the candles with. But as long as the masters are going, as long as the regular candles are burning, you need the servant, the shamas, to keep burning. And now that I got you in the mood for this, I'll give you the more difficult one, which was number 1. And if you don't understand it, that's perfectly fine. This has to do with the laws of Gittin, with the laws of Jewish divorce. It's a quote from the Talmud. It says, Hamolich o hamevi get mimdinat hayam. A person who takes or transports a get in Gematria is 12, from overseas. Hayam in Gematria is Hey Yud Mem, 55. Okay, so if you take away the get, the writ of divorce from the Yam, take away 12 from 55, what do you end up with? What is 55 minus 12? 43, okay? But we're still missing a number. Sarich echad letzaref elav kedei sheyehe mekuyam. You need one more to add so that it will stand. And this is very, very clever, because in the Talmud, it means that if a person brings a get from overseas, he needs another witness to testify that this was a kosher get, that there was actually a get ceremony. That's what the original meaning is. The secondary meaning here is, if you take away 12 from 55, you end up with 43, and you need to add one more in order to get to the magic number of 44, which is the number of Hanukkah candles. If you didn't understand that, I apologize, but that's a very clever take on a passage in the Talmud, applying it to the number of Hanukkah candles. Now we're going to look at two other riddles. What are you saying?
What does it have to do with the Fanai Nichtav and Fanai Nichtam?
Right. Well, they're saying that the person who brings the get needs somebody else, needs another witness to say that it was done properly. Okay, that's what Hamolich Vamevi get means. Okay, let's skip to 2 different types of riddles. Let's skip to number 6. Now, I wrote in parenthesis, which is what it says in the original source from 1470. Nichtav Ayidei Shmerel. A Jew named Shmerel wrote this riddle. You'll understand why that's important in a minute. Shmerel wrote, Vishar Shmarya Yehi Ram Shorsho, which doesn't mean much of anything. It means Shmarya sang, may his height, may his loftiness, may his roots be high. Right? Shmarya sang, may his roots be high. But that's not what's special about this sentence. Can anybody tell me what's special about sentence number 6?
It's a palindrome.
Yafeh, it's a palindrome. And if you look at the English examples I wrote below number 7, and these I collected over the years, every time I taught this, somebody gave me another palindrome in English. So there's a famous palindrome by James Joyce, Madam, I'm Adam. A palindrome means you can read it in both directions and it reads exactly the same way. Madam, I'm Adam, start at the end of the line. It says, Madam, I'm Adam. Abel was I saw Elba. Said about Napoleon, I doubt that Napoleon spoke English. If you read it backwards, it says the same thing. Abel was I saw Elba. Another famous example, a man, a plan, a canal, Panama. If you read it backwards, it says a man, a plan, a canal, Panama. Now let's go back to number 6. Vishar Shmarya Yehi Ram Shorsho. If you start at the end of the sentence in Hebrew and read it backwards, it says the exact same thing. So this is another example of katavis, of a Hanukkah riddle. And example number 7, which is the last one we're going to look at. This was said by the same Yosef ben Moshe, who wrote this book, Leket Yosher, in 1470. And again, the sentence doesn't seem to make any sense. It says, Tavta Yosef la'ad, you were good to Joseph forever, which might be a hint of Joseph we read about in this week's Torah portion. Atz zan harash kachok, he ran and he fed the poor according to law. And this is a summary of the story of Joseph, right? You were good to Joseph forever, And he, of course, fed the people of Egypt and all the other people who were looking for food. However, there is something very special about this sentence. And again, whoever guesses this over the internet deserves a sufganiyah or a latke, depending on what you prefer to eat. What is special about this Hebrew sentence? I should sing the Jeopardy song. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, what is special about this Hebrew sentence is that it uses every letter of the Hebrew alphabet once. Okay, this sentence contains every letter of the alphabet once. And if you don't believe me, you can read it in depth. And indeed, if you look at my addition here at the bottom, this is the way that people used to learn to type. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. This was before there were computers, when you actually needed to know how to type, as opposed to myself, I use 2 fingers. In order to practice typing, you would type this sentence because it contains all the letters of the English alphabet. So the sentence Tavta Yosef La'ad above number 7 contains all the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and the English sentence contains all the letters of the English alphabet. And my friend, Professor Meir Bar Asher at Hebrew University, when I told him this, he told me that his father, who was a sofer, used to use this sentence in order to write all the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Shatnez gets badak chaya melechet sofer. He said that this is the sentence that sofrim use in order to check the quill, to check their pen. They write all the letters of the Hebrew alphabet by writing this sentence, Shatnez gets badak chaya melechet sofer. In any case, these are 7 examples of ketuvos from the 15th century. And I do not have time to give you the etymologies. You're going to have to read my article. But I actually published an entire article in Hebrew on the subject 30 years ago, and 11 different etymology has been suggested for the word ketuvos. The most convincing I found was either from a word in Greek or from a word in Russian. Be that as it may, it's a lovely custom to ask riddles on Hanukkah, related primarily to the laws of Hanukkah or the story of Hanukkah. So if you'd like to adopt this custom, feel free. I have no copyright on it. It's directly from Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Moshe in the 15th century. The second custom, which we will have time for today, I hope, is the custom of playing cards on Hanukkah. And again, the Hebrew sources are followed by my English summary of the sources. I just want a page here in my source sheet. I can see it better on paper. And this custom is first attested, as you can see here, by responsa of Rabbi Jacob Weil in the middle of the 15th century. And it's always amazing the things you can learn from the responsa literature, agav orcha, indirectly, without any intent by the author. Rabbi Jacob Weil was asked about Shamar Ruven v'Moshe Machmat Bito Shabala Shimon Ech Shehu Mebazbez et Shelo B'Schok. He was approached by Ruven and his daughter because the son-in-law is wasting his time b'schok. Now that's the 3rd line in the Hebrew. Schok in modern Hebrew means laughter. Schok in medieval Hebrew does not mean laughter. Schok in medieval Hebrew means gambling with cards. So the son-in-law is wasting his time gambling. And not only is he gambling, he's doing it in the pubs of non-Jews. Umishtaker, and he's getting drunk. Umeki, and he's throwing up. So what does the wife say, the daughter of Reuven? To'enet ma'is alai b'tovar ktubata. She says, I'm sick and tired of this guy. I want my ktuba money. I want a divorce. V'Shimon eshiv, listen to Shimon's reply, the guy who's playing cards. Sheino says shum schok shelo kahogen rak b'Hanukah kaminhag. Shimon says, I'm not doing any improper gambling with cards. I only do it on Hanukkah according to the minhag. This is the first testimony we have of gambling with cards on Hanukkah in the middle of the 15th century in Germany. If we go down to source number 2, and I probably won't have time to read the entire source, here we have a very interesting book, which was only published about 30 years ago from a manuscript, the custom book of Rabbi Yuspa Shamus. As you can guess from his name, what was his profession? He was a shamus. He was a shamash of the Jewish community of Worms. He died in the year 1678. And his book is a gold mine of Jewish laws and customs. If you want to know what Jews actually did in Germany in the 17th century, you go to the book, the custom book of Rabbi Yosef Shamash. For example, one of the most complete descriptions we have of a bar mitzvah in the 17th century is from the work of Rabbi Yosef Shamash. So here you can see the heading. I'll make it a little bigger if I can. The heading is Hanukkah. Okay, so he tells us that a certain Rabbi Binyamin HaKohen, who was the head of the Jewish community in Worms in the year 1638, he made a cherem, he made a prohibition against any type of schok. If you can see the little arrow, I'll put it on the second line. Schok is gambling. Hein karten, you're not allowed to gamble with cards. O im kubiyot, not with dice. So we think that our ancestors were such great tzaddikim and chasidim. So you see here in the 17th century, Jews are playing with cards, they're gambling with cards, they're gambling with dice, or any type of schok, except for Schuchtzfeld, which is chess. He says that chess is permissible. You should know that in the medieval period, when they played chess, they gambled on every game. It was a money-making proposition. He says you're allowed to play chess, you're not allowed to gamble on cards and on dice. But the interesting thing to us is the end of the third line. And he forbid this the entire year. Rak b'Chanukah, but on Hannukah, hayam matir b'schok. But on Hanukkah, he allowed playing cards. So again, we see, just as in the first source, which is from the 15th century, the second source from the middle of the 17th century, says that on Hanukkah, you're allowed to gamble over cards. But then we skip to the last sentence. There was another rabbi who didn't like this, who came after Rabbi Binyamin, Rabbi Zussman, who was the rabbi after Binyamin. This is the very last line in the Hebrew. Siva b'knas gadol, he decreed with a big penalty, shelo yisachaku Hanukkah, or afilu b'Chanukah, you should not play with cards even on Hanukkah. Anashim ve'yashim yachad, men and women together, God forbid. Be'onesh gadol. It's not clear that he was opposed to the gambling, or to the men and women gambling, or to both. But the first rabbi allowed gambling with cards on Hanukkah, and the second rabbi in the very same community of Worms forbade it. Now we continue on in Worms a little bit later in Jewish history. And we're at the father. How many of you, I'm sure you've all heard of Bert Bacharach, right? Who hasn't heard of Bert Bacharach? Well, I'm pretty sure that Bert Bacharach is a descendant of the two rabbis we're going to quote now, Rabbi Yair Chaim Bacharach and his father, Rabbi Shimshon Bacharach. And I translated part of it in English, which is over here on the side. So Rabbi Yair Chaim Bacharach, who died in 1702, he tells us that in one of his responsa that his father, Rabbi Shimshon, was very, very upset about this custom of gambling for the 8 nights of Hanukkah. And I'm reading the main passage, which is English on the right. And it annoyed my pious father that the miraculous days of Hanukkah, which were established to thank and praise God, should be designated for card playing and frivolity. And he tried to forbid it and move it to the 8 days of their festival. In other words, he said, why ruin our holiday of Hanukkah? If you want to gamble, gamble between Christmas and New Year's. Because between Christmas and New Year's, in any case, there's chofesh, there's vacation. Nobody's working. You want to gamble, gamble then, but don't gamble on Hanukkah, which would not entail canceling commercial transactions because people stay at home in any case. But he did not succeed because they would not agree to change the custom. So even as great a rabbi as Rabbi Shimshon Bacharach, in that very same city of Worms that we read about in passage number 2, he tried to abolish and move the card playing to other days. And as my father, Rabbi Noah Golinkin Zal, used to say, Nishke Stoigen, Nishke Floigen, Lo Azar Klum, nothing helped. Jews like their customs, and their custom was to gamble with cards on Hanukkah. And a very lively description of this custom was penned by my great uncle Herman Lieder, originally of Galicia, of Reiche in Galicia. And he spent many, many years in Washington, D.C., where I knew him when I was growing up. And this is what he wrote in his memoir, Reiche Yidden, published in Washington in 1953, with my English translation on the left. I'm assuming you can all read my English translation. I'm going to read this in Yiddish because it sounds much better in Yiddish. He's describing the holiday of Hanukkah in Reiche, Galicia, around the year 1900, when he was 10 years old. Von Stiffereien und Narrigkeiten seien mir gewesen sehr weit. We're very far from foolishness. Wir haben sich mit derselben Sache nicht abgegeben. We didn't devote our times to such foolishness. Afilu nicht mit sichas chulin. Not even with secular conversation. Chutz Hanukkah, except for Hanukkah. Wenn wir haben etliche Schaim Tag mevatel gewen von lernen. When a few hours every day we would stop learning Torah und gespielt in Kvitlach, and we would play with Kvitlach, which is the Yiddish word, he wrote in parentheses, karten, cards, two equivalents of the same thing. Oder zu geguckt wie andere spielen. We would either play cards or watch why other people play cards. Ich bin gewen von der Letzte. I was one of the people who watched. Weil ich hab kein Geld nicht gehabt, because I never had any money. Und on Geld kann man in Kvitlach nicht spielen. And without money, you cannot play cards. It is a gambling proposition. Bin ich gestanden und gekibitzt, so therefore I would stand and kibitz, as we still say in Yiddish. And then he goes on to say that frequently the one near whom he stood would lose a round and turn around at him and say, "Get away from here, you jinx." Again, it sounds much better in Yiddish. Trog sich ab von dannen du schlimm schlamazel, which is the fourth line from the bottom of the Yiddish, right? How can you compare that to the English? You schlimm schlamazel, you idiot. Get away from me, you're bringing me bad luck. Du bist nicht mazeldik, you are not giving me mazel. Zu lieb dir verlier ich. Because of you, I am losing. And then after that, he would go away, but nobody wanted them to stand next to him. A very lively description of this custom. I'm just going to add one more source, which is not on the page, which I brought in my article. And then we're going to look at the cards themselves. One of the most famous poskim halachic authorities at the end of the 19th century was Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein, who wrote the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan is a compilation on all the sections of the Shulchan Aruch, bringing the Shulchan Aruch up to date until the year 1908, when Rabbi Epstein died. And in the laws of Hanukkah, this is what he wrote. I'm going to translate it straight into the English. He says, those who play cards, their punishment is great. And due to our great sins, this negat tzara'at, this leprosy, has spread through the house of Israel. Oy lanu shalta b'yameinu kach. Woe is mir that this has happened in our days as such. V'chol minei averot tluyot bazeh, and all sorts of sins depend upon this. V'hu rachum yechaper avon. May God the merciful forgive our sins, and whoever can do away with this terrible custom, scharo merubeh me'od, will receive much reward. So you see here at the very same time that my uncle Herman is describing card playing in Galicia, Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein, sitting in Navarodok in Belarusia, is saying that we have to do everything in our power to do away with card playing, but the Jewish people continued to play cards on Hanukkah until the Holocaust and until today. And these are what the cards look like. And you can see that they look like they're handmade. They were handmade. And this game that they played was called Lamed Aleph. Lamed Aleph is very much like blackjack. Instead of getting out when you hit 21, you get out when you hit Lamed Aleph, which is 31. And these are the cards in front of you. I'm just going to go down to the other set of cards because the picture is very interesting, and we will end with that. Another version of the Hanukkah cards. You can see here one of them is Lamed Aleph, the first row, the third card from the left. And it's hard to see all the pictures, but every single picture has a card has a hand-painted picture. For example, the letter Hey, which is 5, has a picture of a hen, because in Yiddish, hen, hon, starts with a hey. Next to it is what is apparently vav, a wolf, a wolf. In Yiddish, the word wolf starts with a vav. Aleph, there's an eagle. In Yiddish, eagle is called adler. It starts with the letter aleph. In other words, on every card, there was a picture of something that starts with that letter, either in Yiddish or in Hebrew. In the second row, you see kafchet, koach, strength. And in the first row, the sixth card is yud dalid yad. And there's a picture of a hand, and so on and so forth. So these handmade cards are the cards being described here by my uncle Herman. We see here that we have this documented Jewish custom on Hanukkah of playing cards from the middle of the 15th century until the Holocaust. And I know that there's still many Jews who play cards on Hanukkah. This was a way of passing the time during those 8 nights of Hanukkah. These days, we might play with a dreidel. We might play other games with our children. And of course, we have many other Hanukkah customs, which we won't have time for this year. But to summarize, we saw here a relatively unknown custom of riddles on Hanukkah, riddles having to do with the number of candles and other aspects of the Hanukkah holiday. And of course, you can make up your own riddles. And number 2, the custom of playing cards on Hanukkah, which was widespread throughout Germany and all of Eastern Europe from the 15th until the 20th centuries. So these are 2 more aspects of Hanukkah Exotica that I wanted to share with you this year. God willing, stay tuned next year, and we will examine 2 more Hanukkah Exotica customs. My time is up, and I do not want to take away from the time of my colleagues. If at the end you're still on, I'll be happy to answer questions about these customs. We now segue over to Hanukkah and Jewish art. And our next lecturer is Dr. Shula Laderman, who's been teaching Jewish art at the Schechter Institute for some 25 years, a wonderful teacher. And Shula, I see you, there you are. Shula, bevakasha. Shula, make sure to unmute yourself. I don't know if you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. And you see my screen. I'm going to do the title that we spoke about from the Menorah to the Hanukkiyah, even though Hanukkiyah in Jewish sources, in earlier sources, are not called Hanukkiyah, but Menorah Hannukah. So the connection with Menorah is very real. And we see it here in the first coin that we have from the Hasmonean dynasty. We know that the Hanukkiyah or the Menorah that appears in art starts from the Hasmonean time. And what you see here is a coin that was issued by Matityahu Antigonus, who was the last king of the Hasmonean, who lost the kingdom to Herod. Herod was supported by the Romans. Matityahu Antigonus was supported by the Persians, and King Herod won. And what you see here is the political usage of the menorah on a coin. A coin in ancient time was really the media. If you wanted to transfer any kind of message, this was a good way because it was small, but it went from one to another, so you could say something through the usage of the coin. Now here, the reason why Matityahu Antigonus used the coin was because he wanted to impress upon the people to support him, because he is not only a king of Israel, but he's also a Kohen Gadol. Whereas Herod, King Herod, is not even considered Jewish because his father was Edomite. So that it was important enough for Matityahu Antigonus to put this on his coin. On one side was the menorah that you see here, and the other side is something that we think is the shewbread table, the shulchan lechem hapanim. And this is really the oldest image of the menorah that we have, and we'll see that this was used. We don't see the base here, but we do see the menorah with the seven candles, and it's very small. But the point was that when the Hasmoneans won, when their victory and they cleansed the temple, dedicating the altar and other vessels, the holiday of Hanukkah was established to remember the event. That's why we have this connection to the menorah that was reestablished, and it represented the political declaration of the Hasmonean when in 165 BCE, they conducted their successful war against Antiochus IV, the Epiphanes, who captured Jerusalem, installed an idol in the temple, and issued a series of decrees against the Jewish religion. And of course, the Hasmonean won, and that was the wonderful victory that was commemorated with the holiday. So what you see here is the coin that I explained to you with the menorah on one side, and what we think is the showbread table on the other side. Now we know that the menorah was a sign of the priests. We have in Jerusalem, we have the Yazon grave and Rehov Alfasi in Rechavia. In Jerusalem, there is a cave that has this drawings on the walls, and you see here different kinds of menorahs. It doesn't have the 7 candle menorah, but it has other kinds of combination, and we'll see in a minute why. Also in the excavation that were done in the upper city, in the old city after the 1967, and one of the walls of the houses of the of the priest, the upper city was settled by the priest, and they found this menorah, which you see some of it was completed, but it's a menorah that's very much in keeping with the description of the Bible in the book of Exodus, where you have the flowers and the cups and the gvi'im, and this is what remained as a menorah from the time of the temple. And you could see here the base as well, meaning the candles, the candelabra has the round candles, and it has a base too, but it's very similar to the one we saw in the coin. Now here we see that when the Romans did manage to conquer, to win against the Jews, and they took the menorah with them to Rome, and we have here the Titus, the Arch of Titus, with the menorah being taken captive, and this became a sign of defeat. The menorah that was the holy sign that symbolized the temple and the divinity. Now we have it going into Rome, and so this arch was established in 81. The destruction of the temple was in the year 70, and this was done by the court, by the Senate's decree, to put this, because each conqueror got to have an arch to commemorate his winning against an enemy. So you could see that the menorah that we have on the Titus gate, very similar to the menorah we have on the coin of Matityahu Antigonus. You see, we don't have the base. The base here is very problematic because that is a base that must have been added by the Romans when they took the menorah to make it stronger, because it has different images that are Roman and pagan, and it wasn't part of the original menorah. But the interesting thing is that this very menorah, and I don't know, you have to strain your eyes, I put it in a circle. We have here a beautiful painting done by Nicolas Poussin in the 17th century, and where he's describing the destruction and sack of the temple in Jerusalem. He did it because he wanted to speak about the war that was going on in Europe for many years between two Catholic countries. And he wanted to show that once there is a war, no one can stop the war. And this painting is based on what Josephus wrote in the Wars of the Jews, where he describes that Titus came up to the temple. He didn't burn the temple, but he went to retire. And while he was retiring, the way he writes, the Jewish zealots were attacking the soldiers, and the battle arose, and somebody threw a torch and started burning the temple. You can see the fire here, which was not Titus' a decision to do. And here's Titus coming, he hurries to stop. You see his hand to stop, but nobody is listening to him because the war is on. And that's how the temple is destroyed, and the menorah is being taken. And the menorah that he describes is the menorah that we see on Matityahu Antigonus. This is the menorah that we see on the coin, and this is the menorah we see on the Titus art, and this is the menorah we see right here in this painting. So this became the symbol of the menorah. And because for many years, almost 100, many more, the Jews regarded the Titus gate and this description as a sign of defeat, they didn't use the menorah in Jewish art. And it took about 100, 150 years before the menorah returned to be a symbolic image for the Jews. Now we see this in the Dura Europus synagogue. Dura Europus synagogue is a synagogue that was found in Babylon, near the Iran, actually Persia, and the border of the Roman Empire and the Persians. And this is a synagogue that was destroyed in 256, meaning in the middle of the 3rd century when the Persian attacked the Romans. And we have it, we have the pictures because the whole synagogue was covered with paintings that are earlier than any Christian painting, because this is the middle of the 3rd century. The churches were started to be built only in the 4th century. And we have here all the signs that have to do with the temple. We have the frontis of the temple with the 4 pillars, one Yachin and Boaz and the other 2. And in the middle, instead of what in a Roman temple would be an idol, here you have the Ark of Covenant, or the temple itself, the entrance to the Holy of Holies. Next to it, we have the menorah, and look at the menorah. This is a menorah with straight candles, not with the round ones. We have the etrog and lulav, and we have the sacrifice of Isaac, meaning they wanted to make sure that we understand that these are symbols of the temple, Har Moriah, where Abraham came with his son Isaac. And here is the ram that was sacrificed instead. So this is one of the signs where the menorah starts to be part of the symbol for Zecher HaMikdash, the memory of the Mikdash, that was so dear to the Jews all throughout history, and Jewish art shows it and displays it. So you have the menorah and all the signs. Now here we have a tomb gate. This is a funeral. This is like a cave of graves, and the door to the cave is made of stone, and it has all the signs. And one of the signs that you see here is the menorah. And this menorah, if you count, doesn't have 7 candles, but 8, and a shamash. We have here like a Hanukkiyah that we use till today. And it means to show that this is the Hanukkiyah. It's based on the menorah, but it's special. And why is it special? Because we have in the Baraita, in the Babylonian Talmud, we have both in several places, Rosh Hashanah and Avodah Zarah, and in several of others, that it says the following: as it has been taught, a man may not make a house in the form of a temple, or a porch in the form of the temple court, or candelabrum after the design of the candelabrum. He may not make, even though it be of other materials, since the candelabra of other metals besides gold would have been permissible in the temple. So Rashi explains that the reason why we had to have a different kind of a menorah after the destruction of the temple is because of this ba'ita. And we see that here, where we had on the gate, we had the 8 and the 9, 8 and the shamus. We have also a candle that this is an oil candle, and it also has 8 candles. So, and Jewish, again, the Jewish holy symbol of the temple with the eye of God kind of looking from the temple. This is part of the symbols of the Zecher HaMikdash. And here you have, again, a funerary description in catacomb. Catacombs were burial places where in Rome they didn't allow Jews to be buried in the city, and they went out with Christians who were not yet recognized altogether between the 2nd and the 4th century, and they dug under villas that became Christian, a catacomb, burial caves underground, and there's a huge area of those kind of catacombs, and part of them were used for prayer and for gathering underneath the ground. And here you could see a picture of 2 menorahs, again, a symbol of the temple. We have a curtain that rises and we see the sun and the moon. And the idea is that the person that died is going to hopefully see the temple rebuild. And it's like the temple in the dream, or the hope that there will be another temple. Now we see that more than one instance, the different symbols that you have. This is a beautiful gold glass base from a Jewish catacomb, where when they put with ossuaries or the dead inside the cubicula, they would close it with cement, and in the corner they would put the glass bottom, meaning this must have been a base of some sort of a dish, that on the bottom between 2 layers of glass there was a gold paper cuts from gold paper with the menorahs, and the place of the temple with 2 lions, the tribe of Judah, and other implements here with the lulav and etrog. So this was a design that again wanted to remind us through the menorah of the temple. And we see it in synagogue. This is the synagogue of Caesarea, the Caesarea, and the 5th century. On the title of the pillar, there is a beautiful decorated Corinthian title, but there is the menorah as well. And here we are in the synagogue of Hamat Tveria from the 4th century, where they found also zodiac. So here you have 2 menorahs again, and something that symbolizes the temple, and we have the lulav and all the other signs. The same we have 200 years later in Bet Alpha, and here it's much more stylized, but we have again the menorah, one is lit, one is extinguished. We have the 2 birds, Ba'alei Kanaf, as if symbolizing the cherubim on top of the ark, and we have the Ner Tamid, we have the 2 lions, etc. Another one is Shalom al Israel. Shalom al Israel is a synagogue that is near Jericho, and it's already much more stylized because we have already a distance from the Hellenistic way of making images. And it says Shalom al Israel, has the lulav and the etrog, and has the shofar, and the menorah, of course, the menorah. So this is near Jericho in the 7th century. We then leave Israel because the Muslims come, and Israel, most of the art stops because they were against any images. And so here we find in 2 pages in front of a Bible, a whole Bible. And again, this was found it's now in St. Petersburg, but it's from Egypt. And you can see the menorah, this time it's square, and the candles in a square shape. We have the Aron, the ark with the 2 leaves. Instead of birds, there are leaves, and the other implements of the temple. Again, we move on, and we are in 1300 in Europe, and we have here a Bible that's called the Regensburg Bible from 1300. And you see here the high priest, you see him, Aaron, kindling the menorah, the big menorah with the two lions on both sides. Again, we are in the Bible, where the Bible becomes a mikdash me'at, and like the synagogue, the Bible too, and we have the menorah in front of it. Here is the Aaron. And the same happens in the 14th century, where we have about 20 Bibles that the front pieces of them, the 2 first pages, have all the implements of the Mishkan, including, of course, 1 whole page for the menorah with the Evan, where Evan was in the Mishnah, the description how the high priest would go up to the menorah to kindle the menorah, so that you have that in many of the manuscripts, including this, which is a very interesting manuscript. It's called London Miscellany from northern France, and we see here Aaron, again, very tall and Gothic image, kindling the menorah. And it says here in Hebrew, it says that this is Aaron who is kindling the menorah. And that has a reason, but we won't go into it. We won't have the time. But what's interesting is that Beparashat Baalotcha, when it says, in the parasha, speak unto Aaron and say unto him, when thou lightest the lamp, the 7 lamps shall give light in front of the candlestick. And it means that Aaron, the lighting of the menorah will continue forever. And then we have the Hanukkiyah that really continues the lighting of menorah. And then we have another wonderful manuscript called the Sermer Bible from 1300. And look, we have the illustration of the prophecy of Zechariah of the menorah that is being fed by oil, by the oil that you see here, lighting the menorah. And the interesting thing is that when it came time to establish the symbol of Israel, they took all of these signs, the menorah from the Arch of Titus, and we have here this menorah. We have the leaves that we saw in the Server Bible, and we have Israel, Shalom al Israel, here as part of the sign of the rebirth of the nation. They took the sign of defeat and made it the sign of rebirth. Now, this is interesting because all of this is leading to the Hanukkiyah, to Menorah Hanukkah. Now, I won't go into all the reasons why we light the candles, why we call it Hanukkah, because Chanchu, they dedicated the temple, they dedicated the menorah, etc. But we do have an early source, Megillat Ta'anit, that speaks about the Hasmonean period and the idea that on the holiday of Hanukkah, you cannot mourn, you cannot have Ta'anit. And so this is a very early source. And then we go into Menorot, Hanukkah. We saw that menorah accompanied the Jewish people in Jewish art throughout all the centuries. And then it was started to be built in a certain beautiful way. And in every country Jews lived, they took always some kind of a beautiful architecture from their surrounding in order to build the menorah like it, Menorah Hanukkah. So here we have from Poland, from the 18th century, a shape that reminds us of the wooden synagogues from Poland in the 17th century. You see all the details. Or we have here in Italy, we have the Church of San Andreas in Mantova, Italy, from the 15th century. And the Jews wanted their menorah to look like something very fancy and a beautiful architecture. So they built the menorah of Hanukkah using the same motif in their menorah. And then we have a Hanukiyah that imitates a style of a church in a palace of Sorrenzo in Venice. And you see all of these gates and the shape of the windows being imitated in a menorah. So again, you could see how important it was for the people to imitate and to really glorify their menorahs. This one is a beautiful menorah that was done by Moshe Tzabari in 1967 after the war. And he called this the menorah of Masada. Masada being the sign of victory, and he wanted to design it in a shape that is reminiscent of the mountain range from which rises the high cliff that above all the hills. The menorah is made of polished and shiny silver in a tin, bent in a way that creates dents and humps like mountainous landscape. And the light reflects, because when you have this tin, the light is reflected from the metal creases, and it really brings a feeling of a beautiful, glorious menorah that describes the both the period of the destruction of the Second Temple and the war that the Jewish zealots, but the war of the Israelites in 1967. And all of this is in this menorah of his design. Now, the interesting is that according to Yosef ben Matityahu, the last fighters in Masada fortified themselves and fought until their hopes were lost. They preferred death than to be taken captive. Thus, they committed suicide. But in Masada, the Hanukkiyah is really designed to express the concept of heroism and devotion to the memory of the temple and to the war, maintaining the values and the future as we see it. Now, I want to show you two other menorahs that are outstanding. This menorah is in the Israel Museum. It's a menorah made from tins, and it's a wonderful story. The story goes like this. There was a man named Meir Ben Amu from Mazagan in Morocco, and he made this lamp in 1955. Meir immigrated to Israel and changed his name to Meir Ben Ami and settled in Bet She'an. In Morocco, like many other Jews, he made sardines into oil, sardine in oil tin cans, and he became an expert on working with tin. So his expertise in making utensils for the purpose of memorial candles and lamps and menorahs became famous, and he decorated them with pieces of cloth that he put glass over it. So you see here the back of the sardine cans, and here you see the cloth, the beautiful font of this menorah. Now, what happened was that during World War II, an American soldier asked him to give him one of the Hanukkah lamps, and he made and later the same soldier, who was a Judaica collector named Zayder Maskovich, donated the menorah he got from the Ben Ami to the Israel Museum. And in 1994, his Meir Ben Ami granddaughter saw an envelope that came out of the philatelic service with pictures of menorahs, and she noticed that her grandfather's Menorah is one of the lamps that were on the envelope commemorating the holiday of Hanukkah, and she recognized it, and they invited Ben Ami, and he saw his menorah. And the last lamp that we have here is a very nice lamp that was done by Manfred Hansen in honor of the centennials of the Statue of Liberty from 1886 to 1986. And he made this menorah with the eagle as a shamus, and all of the candles are the Statue of Liberty that you see here. And he devoted the four liberties on the right were the revolt against Rome, Judah the Maccabee, 168 BCE, Babylonia exile, and the exodus from Egypt. And the four liberties on the left are inscribed: Israel 1948, Holocaust 1939 to 45, Herzl Zionist Congress and in Basel in 1897, and Galut. So that's how he created his idea of a menorah that is a sign of freedom and Jewish heroism and Jewish future, past and future, with using the Statue of Liberty. So this is
Shula,
my
wow.
journey to you.
That's a very good note to end on, the connection between the Hanukkah menorah and the Statue of Liberty.
Yes.
That was an incredible survey of menorahs and Hanukkiyot for the past 2,100 years.
Yeah.
You can imagine what Shula manages to do in her course. that was in 30 minutes. So Toda Rabba, Shula, Yishar Kochech.
Okay.
So we have done some Hanukkah customs. We have done a very beautiful survey of menorahs and Hanukkiyot. And we are now segueing over to Jewish history. The two most important sources we have for the actual Maccabean revolt against the Greek Syrians are the first and second book of Maccabees. And we asked Dr. Doron Lopez to give us a brief lecture on the Hanukkah story in those two sources. Dr. Doron Lopez is a lecturer in ancient Jewish history at the Schechter Institute. His specialty is the Second Temple period. And without further ado, Dr. Lopez, bevakasha.
Thank you very much. Can I get an option to share screen?
Share screen? Yeah, I'm sure Michal will allow that.
Have it already. You are a co-host.
Okay,
so
you
no
have it.
problem.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good evening. Hanukkah Sameach. It's quite interesting that one of the main holidays in the Jewish calendar, Hanukkah, is a holiday that most people don't know much about. If we're going to go to a kindergarten and we're going to ask the children to tell us the Purim story, most children would tell us the whole story of Esther and Achashverosh and the whole story of Purim. If 1 month later we're going to go to a kindergarten, to another kindergarten, and ask the children to tell us the story of Passover, most children would be able to tell us the story of Passover. So there are actually three main historical holidays in the Jewish calendar. It's Hanukkah and Purim and Passover. The other holidays, if we're not counting the modern one, the Israeli ones, are not exactly historical. Rosh Hashanah or Sukkot, they don't tell a historic story. So there's not much of a story to tell there. But if we were talking about the three main historical holidays, two of them have a very famous story that most children and adults can tell. But when we come to Hanukkah, most people don't have an exact story to tell. Most of the energies and most of the talks are about the food, how to make the best latkes and where to get the best donuts. So what we're going to try to do in a few minutes is try to understand the story of Hanukkah, or if to be exact, the stories of Hanukkah. Because there are two stories. There are two very different stories of Hanukkah. And when we talk about Purim, we have the Megillat Esther, And when we talk about Passover, we have the Haggadah. But when we come to talk about Hanukkah, we have two books, two historical books, very long ones, about 16 chapters each one. And they're not very famous, mainly because they weren't kept by the Jewish people. They were kept by the Christian church throughout the Middle Ages. So what we're going to try to do is try to get to know them in a few minutes. Those two books, First Maccabees and Second Maccabees, are actually part of the, like I said, the Christian Biblia of the Old Testament, but they're not like the first book of Samuel and the second book of Samuel, or 1 Kings and 2 Kings. First Maccabees and Second Maccabees are two different books that were written by two different authors in different languages in different countries. The first book of Maccabees was written in Hebrew in the land of Israel. The second book of Maccabees was written in Greek by a Hellenistic Jewish author in Libya, in Kyrene, present-day Libya. What I chose to do is to just to pick a few parts of the two different books and try to see how each one tells the story of the revolt against the Greeks and the story of Judas Maccabeus and how the whole plot goes through. So, 1 second, I'll share the screen. Okay, so what I chose to do here is to bring the beginning of the story. How does the story begin in 1 Maccabees and how does it start in 2 Maccabees? If we're going to go to the first book of Maccabees, which, like I said, was written here in the land of Israel in the Hashmonean kingdom, they start by telling us, now it came to pass over here on the left, after Alexander, the son of Philip the Macedonian, who first reigned in Greece. There is a short historical beginning. And then came out of them a wicked root, Antiochus. In those days, they went out of Israel wicked men, and they persuaded many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the heathens that are round about us. Those wicked men out of Israel are actually the Hellenistic Jews in Jerusalem that try to make the Hellenistic culture more, try to make it more popular in Jerusalem. And he gave them license to do after the ordinance of the heathens. That's the beginning of the story. There is an evil Greek ruler, Antiochus, and there is a whole group of Jews in Jerusalem that goes and try to change the Jewish atmosphere in Jerusalem. When we go to the second book of Maccabees, we see a different beginning of the story. Therefore, when the holy city was inhabited with all peace, and the laws were very well kept, and even the kings themselves and the princes esteemed the place worthy of the higher honor, and they glorified the temple with very great gifts. And then, after a few sentences, we see, but one Simon from the tribe of Benjamin did some kind of things that made the whole mess to start. So we see two different points of view. First book of Maccabees says, the Greek ruler Antiochus is a wicked root, he's an evil king, there's no way to get along with him. And there is a whole group of Jews that made the whole problem start. When we go to the second book of Maccabees, even after, under Greek rule, we see that the holy city was inhabited with all peace and the laws were kept. The holy city, or in Greek, the polis, and the laws, the nomos. That those two Greek words are very basic in the Greek culture because every Greek polis or Hellenistic polis needs to get an autonomy to live by its own laws. And if the laws are kept and the polis is inhabited with all the peace, and the Greek kings bring presents to the temple, and Greeks and Jews can get along. But then there is one problematic Jew that starts the whole story. Those are two very different points of view, because the first book of Maccabees, again, written in an independent Hashmonite kingdom, here in the land of Israel, in the Jewish state, there is a very pessimistic point of view about an option of Jews and Greeks living together. Greeks and Jews can't really live together, and there is a whole group of problematic Jews. Even today in Israel, there's always a group that's to be blamed. If it's a right wing, if it's a left wing, if it's the ultra-Orthodox or the secular or the Jews living in Judea and Sermer, there's always a whole group to be blamed. If we're going to take this group and kick them out of Jewish society, everything is going to be okay. But the second book of Maccabees, written in the diaspora, can't say that there is a whole group of Jews who are problematic, because a Jew who lives in the diaspora prefers to blame only one Jew with the whole problem, and a Jew that lives in the diaspora is quite optimistic about the option of Jews and Greeks living together. After all, the author is writing in Greek. He lives in a Greek world, so he has to be optimistic. So that's one point of view of how those two books start. We see a very different point of view about how to begin the story. Then we're going to see another part of the story. And we're going to ask ourselves, who's a hero from the point of view of those two books? If we're going to go and read this story on the left, we're going to see that the first book of Maccabees tells us a story about Jews that ran away from Jerusalem in order so they won't have to live under the laws of Antiochus. They can keep the Shabbat and eat kosher food, etc. Then many, I'm reading on the left, then many that sought after judgment and justice went down to the desert, Judea's desert, and forthwith the king's soldiers went out towards them and made war against them on Shabbat. And they said to them, "Do you still resist? Come forth and do according to the edict of King Antiochus, and you shall live." Then those Jews on Shabbat on the desert say, "We will not obey the king's edict. We will not fight against you." And we can see underneath, they were slain with their wives and their children and their cattle to the number of 1,000 persons. And then Matityahu, the leader of the Hashmonite revolt, and his friends hear about it, and they mourn for them. And then they said, if we're going to do exactly what they did, which means not to fight on Shabbat, maybe not to fight at all, then the Greeks will win the battle and win the war against us with no problem. And they determine in that day, saying, whoever shall come against us to fight on Shabbat, we will fight against him, and we will not die as our brothers were slain in the secret places. And then we can see how this whole story changes, because the son of Matityahu, Judas Maccabeus, rose up in his stead and with his brothers put on a breastplate as a giant, and his girth a worm-like armor about him in battles, and he took his sword, and salvation prospered in his hand. If we're going to tell the story of the revolt from the point of view of the first book of Maccabees, in order to change the fate of the Jewish people, you can't just sit down and wait for the Greeks to hurt you and to catch you even if it says, even if they come to you on Shabbat, you have to fight back. The big hero of the first book of Maccabees is Judas, who puts on an armor, takes a sword, and goes out to the battlefield. And then we see on the second book of Maccabees that there are other heroes that we can't find in the first book of Maccabees. The stories are quite hard to read, and there are a lot of them. I brought only a few parts of the stories on the right part of the page. For two women were accused to have circumcised their children, and they were led about through the city with the infants hanging at their breasts, and they threw down headlong with them from the walls, and others were burnt alive with fire. Elazar, one of the chief of the scribes, a man advanced in years and comely countenance, were pressed to open his mouth to eat swine's flesh, but he, choosing rather a most glorious death than a hateful life, went forward voluntarily to the torment. And we can see that those terrible stories go on and on. And we see that there is another story, the one that's today known as Hannah and her 7 children. Over here, they don't mention her name, but the mother with 7 children that were apprehended and compelled by the king to eat a swine's flesh against the law, against the Jewish law, of course, for which they were tormented with whips and scourges. But one of them, who was the eldest, said those, "What wouldst thou ask or learn of us? We are ready to die rather to transgress the laws of the God." And each one of the children goes on to carry on a speech against Antiochus. We will not go against the laws of God. We will not eat the swine. We will not bow to before you. And last of all, after the sons, the mother was also consumed, and the wrath of the Lord was turned into mercy. So if we want to know what changes the faith of the Jews, what stops the terrible situation and starts hope that things will change, when we go to the first book of Maccabees, we see that the only story in the first book of Maccabees about Jews that just sit and are prepared to die in order to keep the Shabbat, those Jews are described as people who are wrong. There's no way that there is any chance for Judaism if each one of us will just sit down and not fight back. The thing that every Jew has to do is to take on his sword and his armor and to go into the battlefield. And like first book of Maccabees says in last sentence here, salvation prospered in the hand of Judas Maccabeus when he took his sword. When we go to the second book of Maccabees, the wrath of God was turned into mercy after all those children were killed by Antiochus, after all those elderly men were killed by Antiochus. So who's a hero from the point of view of the first book of Maccabees? A Jew that goes down to the battlefield and fights. Who is a hero from the point of view of the second book of Maccabees? A Jew who's willing to die in order to keep the Jewish law. There are battles in both of the books. After all, both books of Maccabees are a story of a revolt and a war against Seleucid Greeks. But the description of those two battles, of the different battles, are very different. When we look at the first book of Maccabees, we see different battles that are described from a tactical point of view. We're not going to tell the whole stories of all the battles that are described, but we can see when Gorgias, the Seleucid general, took 5,000 men and 1,000 of his best horsemen, and they tried to catch Judas by night. And the Jews, under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus, after he heard of it, he rose, he and his valiant men, to attack the king forces that were in Emmaus. We can see a lot of geographical details. We see how Judas goes out of his camp and goes to attack the enemy's camp by night. We see the different names of places in Judea. And that's the story of battles in the first book of Maccabees. We can see a general that uses tactical brilliance, uses intelligence, information, that knows the geography of the land of Israel, and wins in the battlefield. When we see the different battles that are described in the second book of Maccabees, we see something very different. On the right, but Timotheus, another Seleucid general, who are before overcome by the Jews, called together a multitude of foreign troops. And then Judas Maccabeus has to prepare for the battle. What does he do? He prayed to the Lord, sprinkling earth upon their heads and girding their loins with hair cloth, and lying prostrate at the foot of the altar, besought him to be merciful to them and to be an enemy to their enemies. So a thing that you have to do before going into battle is to pray, and not to get ready from a military point of view. But as soon as the sun has risen, both sides join battle. The one part having with their valor the Lord for surely all victory and success, but the other side making the rage their leader in battle. But when they were in the heat of the engagement, there appeared to the enemies from heaven 5 men upon horses, comely with a golden bridles, conducting the Jews. 2 of them took Maccabees between them and covered him from every side with their arms and kept him safe, but cast darts and fireballs against the enemy. So we can see how the first book of Maccabees tells us that if you want to win a battle against the Greeks, you have to be prepared. You have to go and use various tactical methods. But from the second book of Maccabees, you have to pray, and then you will see a miracle that just comes down from the sky upon you. Another part of the story, and again, I'm taking a 16 chapters long book, and I tried just to pinpoint a few short parts out of it. We see a very major part of the 2 books, the liberation of the temple and the purification of the temple after Judas takes Jerusalem from the Greeks, from the Seleucid Greeks. We can see that the story in the first book of Maccabees is very long. It's twice as long, or maybe 3 times as long as the story of 2 Maccabees. First Maccabees, we see that they come to the temple and they cleansed the holy places and took away the stones that were defiled into an unclean place. So, see how many verbs there are. They sanctified the temple, and they made the new holy vessels, and they brought and the candlestick, and they put incense, and they gave light in the temple, and they set the loaves. So the Hashmonai soldiers do a lot of actions when they purify the temple, and most importantly, in the last sentence, they built also at this time high walls and strong towers, lest the Gentiles should at any time come and try to catch it again. So if you want to purify the temple, you have to do all of the various actions from the religious point of view, but you also have to do all the actions in order to protect the temple and Jerusalem with walls and towers and military actions. When we look at the second book of Maccabees, we see that there not many actions. Basically, they just go into the temple and purify it. It's a much shorter description. And when they've done those things, they besought the Lord, lying prostrate on the ground, that they might no more fall into such evils. What does a Jew do from the point of view? So it's the second book of Maccabees. In order to protect the temple, fall upon the ground and pray to God to keep the temple. The first book of Maccabees says, okay, you have to pray, but you also have to build walls and towers and take your fate into your own hands. Of course, every book and every story has to have a happy end, after all, but we see that those two books find their happy end in a very different historical point. This first book of Maccabees goes on to tell the story of Judas Maccabeus. After he dies, his brother Jonathan leads the rebels, and after he dies, another brother, Shimon, leads the Jewish nation, and after he gets killed by his enemies, his son, Yochanan Horkenus, keeps on leading the Jewish independent state. By then, there is a independent state in the land of Israel. And the end of the first book of Maccabees, very similar to the book of Kings, ends in describing the Jewish leader, the Jewish king, and concerning the rest of the acts of Yochanan Horkenus and his wars and his worthy deeds, which he bravely achieved in the building of the walls which he made. All those was written in his book that he after his father died. So a happy end from the point of view of the first book of Maccabees is Jewish independence and a dynasty, a Jewish Hashmonite dynasty of priests, high priests, and kings and generals that will lead the Jewish nation into 100 years of independence. That's a happy end. When we look at the second book of Maccabees, the story ends in 161 BC, when Judas Maccabeus wins his last battle, and there are no more ungodly laws, but by Antiochus, the temple is purified and came back to Jewish hands. Jerusalem is fine and Jews can live there. And we can see that the second book of Maccabees ends with a prayer, of course. So fighting with their hands, but praying to the Lord with their hearts, they slew many enemies. So these things been done with relation to Nicanor, the Greek general. And from that time, the city was possessed by the Hebrews. A happy end from the point of view of the second book of Maccabees, written by a Jewish Hellenistic author in the diaspora, is not independence. A Jew that lives in the diaspora can live without independence, but he can't live when the Greek ruler doesn't let him to keep the Jewish law. But when this evil Greek king is gone and the city of Jerusalem is once again can live by the Jewish laws, from that time the city was possessed by the Hebrews, and that same city that was mentioned in the first paragraph of the book, when the holy city was inhabited with all the peace and the laws were very well kept. We came back to the beginning of the story, and that's a very Hellenistic style of a story. The story starts with a good situation, then there is a problem, and then in the end, the city, the polis, comes back to a very well-kept situation. First book of Maccabees starts with that Jews can't really live after Greek rule, and the happy end is when there is a Jewish independent state in the land of Israel. Which one? I'm going to end now in a few last sentences.
That's the $64,000 question, Doron.
Yeah.
With a real story, please stand up.
Exactly. So I don't know which one of the stories is true. What I can tell, let's stop the sharing. Really, a real historian knows that there is no option to know what happened in the past, specifically 2,200 years ago. There is no way to know exactly what happened. Most things we don't even know what happened last week. But we can learn from that Jews that live in the diaspora and Jews that live in an independent state of Israel, if it's today or 2,200 years ago, have different points of view. Is one of them wrong and one of them right? No. But a person who writes down a story writes down from his point of view, from his cultural, from his religious point of view. A Jew that lives in the diaspora has a specific point of view, which is very, very obvious in the second book of Maccabees. In the first book of Maccabees, we see another point of view of a Jew that lives in a Jewish independent state. Whether today, in 2021, Jews that live abroad, live in the diaspora, and Jews that live in the land of Israel, in the state of Israel, can share a common point of view, or will they always be very different and they won't understand each other? It's a question that I will have to leave unanswered.
Well, thank you, Doron, for that challenge. When I was a student at Hebrew University in the 1970s, I think most of my professors thought that the more accurate version was the one in the first book of Maccabees because it was written in the land of Israel in Hebrew. I happen to agree with them, but I'm not a historian, so I have that luxury. Without further ado, we will now segue to our last lecture. And there's a saying in Yiddish, which is very appropriate for our situation now, which is man tracht und Gott lacht, that man thinks and God laughs. In English, man proposes and God disposes. Our lecturer, Dr. Tanya Sermer, is an expert in Jewish music. She has a doctorate in musicology from the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. She teaches in the Rothberg School at Hebrew University. And she's also the artistic producer of the Jerusalem Oratorio Choir, which has 150 singers and 6 conductors. Unfortunately, her infant child has been sick for the past few days, and she's not able to teach live, but she was nice enough to record her lecture about the music related to Hanukkah, and she said she would tune in at the end if you have questions. Her title is Handel, Heroism, and the New Jew, Pre-State Songs for Hanukkah. As you may know, many of the most popular songs we sing on Hanukkah were written before 1948, and this tells the stories of some of those songs. So this is Dr. Tanya Sermer on this fascinating topic in music related to Hanukkah. And Michal is nice enough to put it on the screen for us.
And some of the reinventions that...
Sorry, here we go.
Good evening, Shavua Tov, Hanukkah Sameach. Thank you all for sticking around until the end. I'm going to be speaking about music for Hanukkah from the early part of the 20th century in order to give us a taste of the Zionist take on the holiday and some of the reinventions that went into developing the Zionist narrative. We just heard from Dr. Lopez all about the Maccabees, and we will start our conversation by discussing the figure of Judah Maccabee, the victorious hero depicted here in a Baroque painting by Flemish painter. We're going to begin our story about pre-state Hebrew music about 250 years prior with the German composer Georg Friedrich Handel, who lived for most of his career in England and wrote much of his dramatic and religious works in English. We are going to talk about his oratorio, Judas Maccabeus, from 1746. An oratorio is a very large, dramatic piece of music, much like an opera. However, unlike an opera, it is performed as a concert piece. There are no sets, there is no acting, and there are no costumes. It's simply performed in a concert setting with orchestra, soloists, and chorus, and many oratorios were written to very dramatic biblical stories. You will likely have heard of Handel's Messiah. That was an oratorio as well. So we are going to be discussing, first of all, his oratorio Judas Maccabeus, which of course tells the story of the Maccabees and their heroic triumph over Antiochus. The famous chorus that we are going to discuss comes from the end of the oratorio, from the third act. See, the conquering hero comes. This is when the Maccabees return triumphant after the war. And first, the chorus of the youths, the young men, start by singing, then the young women sing, and then, as they're building consensus, the entire chorus, the entire people of Israel sing together. The young men are performed in modern performance by the women in the choir. The young women are then also sung by the women, and then the final verse is sung by the entire choir all together, all the men and the women together. Here are the lyrics. See, the conquering hero comes, sound the trumpets, beat the drums, and we will hear in the first verse a prevalence of the horns and the brass section. In the second verse, see the godlike youth advance, breathe the flutes, lead the dance, and of course we will then hear prevalence of the flutes in the orchestra. And then in the final verse, when the entire choir and the entire orchestra will come together, all the strings, all the brass, all the woodwinds, and then in particular, as we near the final cadence, you will hear a prevalence of the timpani, the very, very large bass drums, which will add to the heroic nature of the music and to the pomp and circumstance. For the sake of time, I'm going to play you the first verse and then skip ahead to the third verse. You can hear the enormity of the resources that were brought together for this. This is a very large orchestra, an enormous chorus, all of the brass and the woodwinds and the drums, the percussion section, and you can imagine that at the end of this, the audience erupts into applause. This is the kind of majesty and pomp and circumstance that this song is supposed to inspire. So this oratorio is actually written as a commentary, as an allegory for contemporary social and political events of the time. I could actually give a similar lecture for every holiday of the year and show how various operas, oratorios, and other musical works used dramatic biblical stories as allegory for contemporary events. And in this case, the story of the Maccabees was used to celebrate this fellow, Prince William, the King of England, the Duke of Cumberland, who had just returned triumphant from defeating the Jacobite Rising in Scotland. So Handel actually wrote this oratorio in honor of Prince William and used Judah Maccabee as the metaphor for Prince William's victory. This story and this chorus in particular actually captured the imagination of many other composers and artists. The chorus, "See the Conquering Hero Comes," was actually adapted by many others, by Beethoven for variation on piano and cello. It became a German Advent song leading up to Christmas, a French Easter hymn. So in both of these cases, the figure of Judah Maccabee is juxtaposed on the figure of Jesus. British brass bands play this piece, and apparently even in Japan, the piece is used for awards ceremonies. What is particularly interesting in our case is how this chorus and how this figure of Judah Maccabee was adapted by Hebrew poets and by Hebrew composers. So here is the song Hine Hu Ba in Hebrew, which is simply a quite direct translation of Handel's chorus by Aharon Ashman. He wrote it for the 1932 first Maccabees Games. At the opening of the games, they played a medley of Jewish songs about Jewish heroism. And so this song was actually written for that event. The Maccabees Games, of course, being a very important athletic event. What is interesting, though, is that this is not actually the Hebrew version that most people know today. The Hebrew version that we know was written also in the 30s, just a little bit later, by Levin Kipnis in 1935. Levin Kipnis was an author, a poet, an artist, and an educator. And he actually taught at the Levinsky College of Education, and he taught preschool teachers. And this was his big life's work, was his contribution to children's education and children's literature. And at the time, there really was not there wasn't enough literature for children or songs for children in Hebrew. So he took it upon himself to write some. And he is actually accredited to having written about 250 children's songs, in addition to plays and stories. And so many of classic Hebrew songs for kids were actually written by him. And so his version of this text is Havana Rima, which is the Hanukkah song that children today know. It is a reinterpretation of the hero of Judah Maccabee. Havana Rima, let's raise the torch, sing together. Yachad Ponashira, we will sing together this Hanukkah song. We see in the second verse, who are the Maccabees, or who are the victors? Maccabim anachnu. We are the Maccabees. We raise the flag. Vayevanim nilchamnu. We are the ones who fought the Greeks. Velanu hanitzachon. Victory is ours. So in this case, the conquering hero is not coming from afar and coming home. We are actually the ones who are the victors. We are the Maccabees. And he wrote this text to the same music as the chorus from Handel. I will play for you a recording of this from 1965, and what's interesting here is that first they sing Havanarima, the text that we see here on the left, which most kids know today, and then right after that they go into Hine Uba on the right, the text from previously.
Havanarima Nesva Abuka Yahat Pona Shira Shira Hannukah Havanarima Nesva Abuka Yahat Pona Shira Shira Hannukah Maccabees אנחנו רגלינו רמנחנו ביבנים נלחמנו ולנו הניצחון פרח אל פרח סר גדול נשזור לראש המנצח מכבי גיבור. הנה הוא בא עם צבא חילו בשופר נריע לו. הנה הוא בא עם צבא חילו בשופר נריע לו. למנצח כבוד נבון שירת החופש והניצחון. הנה הוא בא עם צבא חילו בשופר נריע לו.
You can hear in this you can still hear the march-like pomp and circumstance, the brass fanfare, the flutes, and of course the drumming. This is very much still in the same spirit of the original chorus, but the pronoun is changed, who the victor is that we are celebrating. So this brings us to the allegory of Judah Maccabee within Zionist. Here we can see it's from the same period. This is a stamp of the Jewish National Fund in 1938, and you see the figure of the Sabra, the Chalutz, the pioneer, strong, tall, muscular, outdoors in a field, juxtaposed in front of the shadow of Judah Maccabee. The Chalutz being somehow equivalent or compared to Judah Maccabee, the Sabra being the new hero. Here we have a similar juxtaposition. On the left, we have Judah Maccabee entering Jerusalem in 165 BC, and on the right, Sir Edmund Allenby entering Jerusalem in 1917 on the bottom here. Maccabee and Allenby, a very clear comparison of the two. And here we have a similar image, Bayamim hahem bazman hazeh, in those days. We had the Maccabees, and in these days, we have the Chalutzim. Here on the left, we have a fighter of the Haganah. Here on the right, Maccabee, and in the middle, of course, a photo of the Chalutzim praying both betfilah ubemilchama, in prayer and in war. We have quotes from Herzl, from Jabotinsky, and from Chernyakhovsky showing how the Maccabees will rise again. And who are those Maccabees? The children of those whose ancestor was Judah, the lion of the Maccabees. Where are they? Where are the Maccabees? You are the Maccabee. So it is very clear that within the Zionist story, a very direct link is drawn between the Maccabees of old and the Chalutzim, the Sabras of the new Zionist generation, that these are the new heroes and they are the legacy of the Maccabees. One of the things that the early Zionists did between the 1930s and the 1960s was to revive this tradition of procession, the Hanukkah processions, and specifically this was a relay of the torches. The youth groups would run from the site of Modi'in all the way to Jerusalem with torches. Keep in mind that the modern city of Modi'in did not exist at the time. This is the site of the historical tombs of the Maccabees, and so they would run this relay with torches from Modi'in to Jerusalem, where they would hand the torch to the president of Israel, and then the president would then use the torch to light the official menorah. And you can see here in the posters advertising the relay or the marathon, these strong, athletic types of figures. It actually looks very much like the Olympic torch relay, and this is kind of a national event and sport event. No mention here of any kind of miracles or religious holiday. This was very much an athletic event that happened around the time of Hanukkah. For the sake of time, I will actually skip this, but we do have in the same film archive footage of the torch relay, where you can see the youth groupers handing the torch to President Ben Tzvi. And what we are going to do is look at a song on this. Anu nosim lapidim. We carry torches, words by Aharon Ze'ev and music by the great composer of Hebrew music, Mordechai Ze'ira. This song was written in the early 1930s, same period that we've been looking at. And if we take a look at the first verse, we can see that this is a fairly typical contrasting between light and dark. We carry our torches in darkest depths of night. The paths beneath our feet are bright. Anyone who has a heart which for light is part, which is thirsty for light, should lift up his eyes and heart and join us towards the light. What is very striking is what comes in the second verse. Nes lo kara lanu, no miracle happened to us. Pach shemen lo matzanu, we did not find a jar of oil. We walked through the valley, le'emek halachnu, hahara alinu, we went up the mountains, we climbed up the mountains, and there we found the light. Again, in the third verse, same thing, no miracle happened to us. We did not find a jar of oil, but we quarried the rock until we bled. Ad dam, until there was blood. Vayahi or, ends the song, and there was light. So what is remarkable about this is not only what we've seen so far, that the Chalutzim take on the legacy of the Maccabees and being the new hero, but this absolute negation of and distancing from the idea of the miracle. Really that by our own sweat and blood and work, we brought this on, we brought on the light without any help from anyone. And this is very much an example of negation of the diaspora, and that is a distancing from both the religiosity and the perceived lack of agency of diaspora Jewry, that the sabra, the chalutz, was self-sustaining, was strong enough that we could do things ourselves, and that through our hard work we can achieve anything. And so that is very much what this song represents. And when we listen to it, you will hear again the brass, the percussion, the pomp and circumstance, the march, like we see this theme coming up again and again in these examples so far, and the genius of Ze'ira's melody, which is both minor and modal and major, and he plays with the different ways of writing melody that invokes both ancient sound, but also the light and the heroism. Let's hear. This is now a repeat. So you've heard the whole, you can hear in the second and third verse that on Nes lo kara lanu, each syllable is written on a much longer note so that it emphasizes that message. Nes lo kara lanu. You cannot miss the drama of that moment. And then as each verse goes on, the melody rises higher and higher and higher and higher until we found the light. And that happens in both the second and the third verse musically. It really builds a great sense of drama. The last example that I'm going to bring today is actually a little bit different. So far, we've heard the very heroic style songs of the new Zionist music, but there's another set of music which were translations of Eastern European and Russian songs that were very much in the style of Eastern European and Russian music, which were much sadder. They were and full of Yiddishkeit, and were quite different than what we've heard so far. But we're going to see the way that those songs were adapted, what happened to them. So we're going to look at a song, a poem written in Yiddish, Ihre kleine Lichtelech, My Small Candle, a poem written in Yiddish by Morris Rosenfeld, who was born in Poland and published this in a book of poetry in 1897 in the US. It was composed by Herman Zvi Ehrlich in Poland in 1908, and then translated into Hebrew by Shlomo Zucker. So we see here on the right the Yiddish, in the middle of the Hebrew, and then a translation into English. And this is a story of a very sad experience of Hanukkah, watching the little candles and the stories that the candles tell of the heroic battles and the wonders of the past, and how they can't believe it when they look into the fire of these candles. They can't believe how heroic Jews were then. See here in the second verse, Jew, you were heroic then. You won victories then. It's almost unbelievable. And then it ends with the anguish. The anguish arises in the depths of the heart, asks in tears and pain, what will the days bring? This is very much the experience of Jews who remember their heroic past but cannot fathom how it could have been possible, and what has happened since then, and the uncertainty and the fear of what may happen tomorrow. This is a newer translation. This is the version that people sing today. And just like Hine Uba, which was originally translated more directly and then reinterpreted in a new Hebrew version, so this again is a new Hebrew version, which is also about how my tiny little candles tell stories about past victories in the battles for freedom. But what is very different about this version, as you see, is as we go on here to the third verse, you had greatness, the kingdom was established, but Tisa harosh, lift up your head, kum, your house stands again, get up, renew a once deserted forest, kum ale uchvosh, arise, go up, conquer. This is a completely different ending than the previous version. My tiny candles told me stories of the past of the people, but the candles are also calling to me, kum itorer, get up, wake up, am chayav v'kam, a people live, go live, rise up. And so this is a completely different spirit of the previous anguish and agony and uncertainty and despair, whereas here is the future is glorious. The future is optimistic. We are rising. We will rise. And this victory of the past and this glory of the past is coming again. What's interesting here, though, is that the song maintains the same older style, older melody, and so it's still in that style of the sad despair. And if you hear it, you can hear the tension between them. We'll listen to a little bit, just the beginning and the end, and then we will wrap up. And I will skip ahead to the end. Ariel Hirschfeld says that in the early Hebrew songs, there was a tension between the text and the music, that on one hand, the texts told one story of the forward-looking, optimistic heroism of the Sabra, of the ethos of the new Jew, but the music told a very different story. The music was backward-looking. They used Hasidic tunes or Eastern European or Russian tunes, or they wrote new melodies that were actually written in the style and with the aesthetics of the 19th century. And so the forward-looking lyrics and the backward-looking music embodied the tension between these two worlds, the older world that they were trying to move away from or distance themselves from, and the new world that they were trying to develop. And these two worlds existed both in tension and simply existed together, and that was part of the reality of developing this new Zionist culture and this new Zionist ethos, and so we can see that in the music, and we see that tension in the story of the whole 20th century of Israel and of the various tensions within Israeli culture and within the Jewish narrative. So thank you very much. Chag Sameach, and good night.
Thank you to Dr. Sermer. I don't know if she joined us. Is she here?
Hi.
Oh, there
Yes.
she is.
Both
Well,
kids.
Kol
Hi.
hakavod for sending us a video, even though you you were worried about is it your son or your daughter who's sick?
Yes, my son is sick.
Son. Okay, well, refuah shlema.
Thank you.
So before we have time for questions at the end, if anyone wants to stay on, since our time is up, first of all, I would like to thank our lecturers, Dr. Shula Laderman, Dr. Doron Lopez, and Dr. Tanya Sermer for very interesting and informative lectures in all those areas of art, music, and history. I would like to thank Michal Makov-Peled, our Director of Development, who's been running this video, and Moria Karsagi, who's in charge of public relations, who made all the technical arrangements for this session.